So, lesson 7. So this is the third section of the book and final section of the book. So we're starting to push towards the end of the study. The very first section of the book, we were looking especially at ourselves and our own Christian faith and life. In the next section of the book, we were looking particularly at various family relationships. In this last section, we're looking at the church and our Christian faith relationships. Building walls and digging moats. Which best describes our country? The USA is a dangerous place for Christians. The USA is a Christian nation, or should be. The USA is a good place for Christians to live.
I'd say 3. But, you know, one, I mean, compared to India, where they beat Christians up, beat Christians to death with roving gangs and, you know, other, you know, Muslim countries.
China, throw them in jail. Any Muslim country, yeah, you're...
Torture and kill.
All kinds of bad
randomly
things
blow up the church.
Yeah.
You know, I mean...
Not a bad place to live.
Not a bad place to live.
Okay.
I mean, by comparison, I mean... It's,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're not saying it's perfect.
No.
No place on
I'm
earth
not
is,
saying it's
or
perfect.
ever has been. But anybody else? What about a dangerous place for Christians?
I'd say it's a mix of all 3, but I guess if you're comparing it to other nations, then I'd say no.
Okay, I didn't say, how does this compare to other countries? Just as statements by themselves. So you can consider it either way. You can consider it in comparison, or you can consider it as a standalone. Is this sometimes a dangerous place for Christians?
It's dangerous for your faith.
All right.
Yeah, it's dangerous.
Maybe not so much physically. Sometimes, here and there. But maybe more the temptations that would lead us out of our Christianity, which is frankly a bigger problem.
Well, give some examples. What do you consider?
A culture that would lead you to accept all kinds of perversions.
So like cults here in the U.S.? Is that what
I
you're saying?
think the culture that says premarital sex is okay, homosexual marriage is the way it should be, and that Christians buy into that and lose their faith in the process. A culture that says there's no need to get up on Sunday morning, that should be me time. You should all be laying in bed right now. You know, years ago I would say reading the comics in the Sunday paper, but I don't know if those things still exist, either one. But you know, this should be me time. And
Well, pick all 3 of them then in that case.
well, you could,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is a Christian nation, or should be?
As opposed to Portugal or Italy.
Well, so there's different ways of weighing this, actually. Yeah. So if you travel to, say, Germany or Sweden, the percentage of people in church this morning in Sweden is about 2% of the whole country. We have fallen way off since I started the ministry. When I got into the ministry, it was widely reported that somewhere between 45 and 50% of Christians went to church on Sunday, of Americans went to church on Sunday. We are, as a nation, in the 20s, and if you get to the coasts, you're probably under 10%.
That go to church on Sundays?
Yes. The Pacific Northwest is just a little ahead of Scandinavia. They're at about 4%. Out of every 100 people that live in Seattle, Washington, 4 will go to church on Sunday. 96 will stay home.
Gosh, I didn't know it was that many.
Yeah. Some years ago, there was a fault found in the way they took these statistics, and they went through a couple of counties in Ohio to track this down. Ohio was a part of Ohio. It's a little bit more rural and seems to have a lot more Christian influence. And so they actually tracked down all the churches, and then they did phone surveys, and based on their phone surveys, 45% of the people were in church on Sunday. Based on contact with the individual congregations and adding them all up, they found it was about half that. So when people answered the phone survey, if they were Christian, they knew that they should be at church on Sunday. Maybe they usually were in church on Sunday, and so they answered that they were on church on Sunday, some large percentage of them, despite the fact that, no, they had stayed home.
Maybe they was watching church on TV.
Yeah. Or Saturday night. Yeah.
We can rationalize this all kinds of ways. The point-
Yeah.
Okay, so where was I going with that? For all of that, the United States has never self-identified it's officially as a Christian or religious nation as such. Scandinavia, where only 2% of people get to church, is officially a Christian nation. Finland, my friend Juhani Vitala, who is a pastor in our little free church in Finland, teaches religion in the public school in Finland, in a position that every public school is required to have, even though somewhere between 2 and 4% of all the people are in any way involved in the church in Finland. It is, by its constitution, a Christian nation. It identifies itself that way.
They love they buy into their history a lot more than we do. So they're probably, if they would hold on to the idea of Christian just because they hold on to all traditions, and some people, like there's a folk song like Bobby Brown, when he was born in the little chapel and heard the bells and all this kind of stuff. And this is basically an empty version of Christianity that means nothing. And there's lots of people like that in the United States, but there it's like, well, it's a tradition. We don't believe in it, but it's our tradition. I'm not going to let go of my tradition just because I don't believe in it.
They generally think it's good for morals, a little bit of moral formation. Anyway, so constitutionally, we are not a Christian nation. It's not defined in our nation's founding documents as such.
That's because we can't fight the Methodists that way. It reduces violence.
Or whomever.
Or whoever. Okay. I'm sorry. That was attack.
No, not a problem. But I suppose it depends a little bit on how you defend. So are we talking about what your nation's organizing documents identify itself as, or are we talking about how the population is actually made up? What do we mean by a Christian nation? So that the United States, for most of its history, was a majority Christian nation. That's, I think, pretty clear. To this day, still something like 60 to 70% at least of Americans would identify as Christians if they were asked about what faith they go to. That they go to church, that they practice, that they would know the first thing about what the Bible teaches, that's a whole different question. But that they would self-identify that way. Yeah, so what do we mean by a Christian nation? And this becomes a political football, this becomes an academic football, people kick it around as to whether we are, whether we aren't, whether we should be, whether we shouldn't be. That's all out there. But if you're not, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You know that this comes up bunches of times. People in our own nation's politics, how does practically every politician feel obligated to end whatever stump speech or State of the Union address or political discussion? How do they all end it?
God bless America.
God bless America, right? They all end it that way.
Well, let's take Christmas. I have a Muslim friend, and he and his family celebrate Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make him Christian?
It does not. Not per se. Not so long as he's still identifying as a Muslim, probably. But you never know that not everybody who converts gets it all straight in their head right away and is ready to come out with a public confession of faith.
Because most of them don't celebrate Christmas.
Well, I visited Norway.
Norway.
And I met all my mother's relatives.
Yes.
And there, not one did I find went to church.
Right.
They took me to church, but they themselves went with me, but they don't usually go. And my mother was a very Christian. I remember have to wear white clothes every morning. I'm standing in line and she'd look at it, off to church.
Yeah.
From all my life.
Yeah.
And then here I visit her country and they didn't really go.
They sent all the Christians here when they all emigrated. No, it's just the way the Scandinavian countries have generally gone. Western Europe as a whole. And our country seems to be headed the same direction, right? So, it's debatable. I'm not saying it's yes or no on this one. It depends, first of all, how you define the terms. It does not find its way into our founding documents as such. Even the Declaration of Independence, which talks about inalienable rights given by God, doesn't identify that God specifically as Jesus Christ. Right? It's deist with Jefferson. And Jefferson and Franklin weren't Christians so far as I can tell. They were deists.
True.
They weren't atheists. They weren't Franklin was a little bit agnostic almost, but they were deists. But the Adams brothers, Sam and John, were Calvinist Christians. They were good Congregationalists. And guys like Patrick Henry and such, those guys were good Episcopalians. They had plenty of Christian faith in them yet. It just depends on who you're talking about.
Benjamin Franklin, I think, went to see one of the preachers during the Great Awakening and stuff, just to hear him preach or something.
Oh, probably.
Because he's part of the culture. It wasn't. He didn't have any
Absolutely.
personal belief. He was just, well, he wasn't gonna separate all of his life off and worship the goddess of reason.
It would not surprise me if you found those men in church once in a while, but
It didn't mean they had any faith.
it didn't mean that they were in any way a practicing kind of Christian, or that.
Yeah.
What we do know from their speculations and writings about things theological, Jefferson went through the Gospels, you may know, and he cut out all the things that made no sense to him, and then created his own version of the Gospels that told Jesus' life rationally in his mind. So you get rid of most of the miracles, because miracles don't happen, and you end up with essentially the Sermon on the Mount. Be nice to people. Okay, open and muted hostility. List examples of open hostility to Christians around the world. You see what's going on in the picture there.
Persecution.
So, not so long into Christian history, the Christians came under severe persecution. First from their own cultural cousins in the Jews, and then the Roman Empire. Do you know why the Roman Empire didn't like the Christians?
They didn't believe in the emperor as God.
Yeah.
And it bucked a lot of their societal norms.
Yeah. So as much as Christians were about love and were popular with people early on, they didn't like what it was doing to the order of society. And the Romans had this, because they wanted to unite the empire, they didn't want to foist their traditional religion on everybody in whole, so that all you could do would be go to the temples of the pantheon of gods that they worship. But they did have this cult of the emperor, and once a year you were required to make a sacrifice for the emperor. Or an offering. It was even just a monetary offering. Christians wouldn't do it. Christians were true to their belief that if you don't have Jesus, you don't have God. The emperor certainly, is in no way anything like God the Father. And so, you guys who are Romans can do what you want, but we're not participating in that, because the very first commandment is no other gods. We're not going against that. And the Romans tried to force it because they saw this as pulling at the seams and the fabrics of the unity of the empire. And so the Christians were persecuted. Nero used them as a scapegoat when Rome burned, but later emperors didn't like the fact that Christianity was growing so quickly and it was getting more and more adherents, and then those adherents wouldn't follow this uniting thing that they had in the empire. So you had various, the painting depicts various things. I don't know if you can see from where you're at, but what's going on with this.
Being burned to death.
So, Nero used Christian bodies to light the streets of Rome and burned them to death. I don't know if it really happened in the arena. I think the painter, the artist here, is bringing several things together. And then, of course, you had the arena shows where Christians were thrown to the various wild animals to be torn apart. It's not always been easy being a Christian. In our country, there has been some danger sometimes. The biggest mass shooting in American history, the one with the most loss of life, took place at Sutherland Springs Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Biggest mass shooting in American history, to this day still.
We have a pretty high bar for that kind of thing. How many people did?
About 30.
When did that happen?
2013, 2014 time period, I believe.
Okay, so this is like crazy person stuff, and I'm thinking like the bombing of churches during the Civil Rights Act. I mean, they bombed the churches during the
Shooting.
Shooting, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I don't know
Mass
about
shooting.
I don't
okay.
know about bombings. A lot of the
Okay.
bombings that took place didn't take place while people were didn't take place on Sunday mornings necessarily.
Well, they killed little girls.
Yeah, I mean, there was
small children, so I don't know.
I don't know, but this is mass shootings. This is not
Okay,
this
yeah,
is not other.
okay.
There's lots of ways to kill people. This is mass shootings.
Okay, good.
The other one there, Charleston, Dylan Roof, shot up the AME church in Charleston some years ago.
So how many people died in Sutherland Springs?
About 30. More were
It
injured.
was, yeah.
The person who came in had a beef with someone in the church. I think it was maybe a estranged spouse or something like that, and shot the place up. Eventually, the shooter was taken out by a member of the church who was packing.
I think I remember that.
Nigeria, you hear Boko Haram. So Boko Haram is the Muslim fundamentalist group in especially the northern part of Nigeria. They'll wipe out entire villages at a time. They'll take the young girls and force them to marry Muslim men and to practice the Muslim religion. Fairly serious there. Bunch of church bombings that take place in other countries. The one you see here is in Pakistan, Christian church that got bombed, firebombed. This is one that took place in Egypt. It happens in places like Indonesia. Some of you know because he guest preached for us a few times. Peter Reed, he was a missionary to Indonesia. Peter Reed got to know his neighbors pretty well in Indonesia, and while they weren't all excited about the fact that he was a Christian missionary, they liked him personally. And there was one year, a couple days before Christmas, his neighbors were pleading with him, don't go to church. Just don't go to church this Christmas. I recognize it's your custom, it's your big holiday. Don't do it. Don't do it. Why? Just don't do it. Just not this year. Don't go. They ended up having kind of a service in his house, and the church was burned Christmas Day. His predecessor in Indonesia, Robert Sewall, his wife, Charlotte, was poisoned to death in Indonesia.
So because she was a Christian.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Finland, that I mentioned before, is officially a Christian nation. I don't know if you heard about these two people, Pastor Juhana Pohjola and Dr. Päivi Räsänen, but they have been through these courts a couple of times now. Some number of years they produced a pamphlet that explained the traditional biblical view of marriage. It's not as though they're out on the streets passing this out even. They just published it for use in their churches. And this was seen as a human rights violation by the Finnish courts. And even though whatever the Finnish version of the Supreme Court has essentially thrown the case out once, the prosecutor is not letting go, and he's trying to reformulate the charges in such a way as to make it harder for the judges just to toss the case, because they teach the traditional biblical view of marriage between a man and a woman. As we said when we looked at the three options about Christian nation, dangerous to Christians, good place for Christians. The author then goes into talking about the fact that we often face a much more muted kind of hostility in our country. So, and I mentioned before, so the author lists politicians seeking church endorsements or speaking to congregations as a muted hostility. So I tried to be politically even here. You know both men, and you can see from the background where both men are, and you know they don't like each other. And it's not a new phenomenon. How does this hurt Christianity?
I don't understand muted hostility. How does a politician speaking to a church? Is muted hostility.
That's what we're here. That's what I'm throwing out. So this is what the author states, that the fact that very often in our country, the political wing, the government wing, will try to use the churches to win elections, to push forward its programs. In what way is that actually a kind of, it's not an open hostility, nobody's getting killed. In what way is it a kind of a muted hostility towards Christianity? Well, okay, let's go through here. Is this a practice of the political right or the political left? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Both have been doing it, and both have been doing it practically since the founding. How is it a hostility? That's Robert's question here. How does the church lose in this scenario?
It isolates the possibility of one part not agreeing with the one that's up there. It takes it away from Christ to the center to politics.
So, we don't talk in the biblical terms about a separation of church and state, but we do recognize a distinction between church and state. And we would agree that generally each does best when it stays in its lane. Today you have a lot of hysterics about church-type people or Christian-type people trying to take over the government. I would say I'm more worried, and I think the founding fathers were, about the opposite happening. The government trying to dictate to the church. That's why my ancestors left Germany and became Americans. And you know that was the story of a lot of immigrants in the 18 and 1900s. They left for religious freedom because the state tried to dictate to the church. When the two cozy up too much, the gospel doesn't generally win. At best, the gospel gets pushed into the background a little bit more as people try to create a earthly utopia, which isn't going to happen. At worst, churches just lose their gospel mission altogether. I told you the story in one of my sermons just a week or two ago that when I was serving in Dallas, the son of the former Prime Minister of England, Mark Thatcher, was a member of my church, and I would have British press spooking around the office. And one of the reporters I talked to actually was enthusiastic about going to church, but why? Because the minister she had found at the church she liked to attend preached political views from the pulpit that were amenable to her own. Anytime the preacher is just preaching to the choir full time and telling people what they want to hear, there is no call to repentance. And where there is no call to repentance, there is no real gospel. And a promise of earthly utopia doesn't go there. And maybe I'll step on some toes here, but both the right and the left are pretty devoted to the idea of the earthly utopia. They just don't want to call it quite that. So the church loses in this scenario. It becomes at best a distraction. At worst, you start to lose your mission itself. How might the church think it's winning?
If you get a lot of people in there.
Bring people in, yeah.
Oh, Jesus Christ, that is.
Like, so growing up, here I am in Oklahoma in the Southern Baptist Church, and half the town goes to the First Baptist Church. Everybody, the administrators and stuff. So they're sort of, it's civil rights happens in the 60s, and the stance of the Southern Baptist Church never really took a stand on that. They did take a stand with Hispanics and stuff. We're trying to kick Hispanics out of Oklahoma. But so it was like a huge discovery. So the link between being racist and being Baptist, and therefore possibly Christian, it was pretty. That was the link that was that I was sort of induced from that situation and growing up in it.
Right.
And I found in later that there were like Mennonites that came in volunteer house in Oklahoma City down by the Capitol, and they were not, they were anti-war, I mean, so their linkage between being politically conservative and being Christian, they like the Bible, and that was a huge discovery for me. That not that I wanted to be Mennonite, but just Christianity doesn't equal racism,
Okay, right.
stuff like that. And the truth is, yes, the Baptists avoided taking a stand on that, sort of by, well, we don't want to upset the church because half of us are racist, so
Okay,
so
yeah.
they lost.
Yeah.
They lost it. Maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe they've lost people in their membership. They've lost people going to church over the last 30 to 40 years, and they've tried to play catch up with immigrants and things like that. With them being, so the government. Okay.
So okay.
So that's the opposite. That's the opposite. Oh, they didn't want to play in that game, so. Because, I mean, it would have been disruptive. It would have been very disruptive.
Well, okay. Yeah. So the church might think it's winning as it's cleverly avoiding the hot spots. Like John the Baptist was willing to call the government of his time out, but there was no chance that John was going to team up with Herod, or that Herod was going to get a spot on the podium when John the Baptist was preaching. Right? That was never going to happen.
He lost his head.
Yeah, he lost his head literally. But John the Baptist was not afraid to comment on the issues of the day that needed to be commented on, even if they came out of the government.
Yeah.
The church may think it's winning if it thinks that it's getting some kind of special influence. It's winning favors. It's aspiring to power, and that's not good for the Christian mission, generally speaking. Go ahead.
Isn't it kind of why people didn't like JFK or Biden because he's Catholic? They're Catholic, and so they were.
So I don't know that I've heard so much about at this point in time. I think the JFK thing, 60 years ago, pretty much put that to bed. But that was an issue with JFK.
Right.
They were afraid that since the Roman Catholic Church historically has tried to take over governments, and the Pope has proclaimed himself head over all the governments, that if JFK as a Catholic gets elected, it's the camel's getting his head into the tent, and we've got a problem as a country. And JFK said, I'm not running.
We didn't want to vote for him.
I'm not running to be the Pope's lackey here. I'm going to follow the Constitution and all of that, and which I think pretty much turned out to be the case. But yes, people have had that kind of concern also. So, this lesson is going to. We're going to see that Christians ought to have some. As Christian citizens, you'll want to be serving and working. You can't completely remove yourself from the world, and your faith will come along with you. But as church, as an institution, we need to be careful with this because it gets in the way of the mission in various different kinds of ways. That's why I might have a politician I really like. I'm not going to give him my pulpit. A good place to break, I think.
Good, because we don't want them up there in the pulpit.
Good. This is the author's concluding statement to this. To the extent the church's arm is twisted or its back scratched, to deflect attention away from preaching the unworldly wisdom of the foolishness of the cross, to that same extent it suffers subversive hostility from the very world it seeks to save. So just... Yeah, the theological terminology isn't separation of church and state, but there is a distinction between the two. And Martin Luther in particular was concerned that the two kingdoms be recognized as what they are and not get into each other's business too much. All right, pick it up there next time.